being totally shocked, because things like that didn't happen in Marble Falls.
I hereby certify that I held an inquest over the remains of Lanice Danan Lewis and found that death was due to strangulation, accidental.
I feel like you have really kept this case alive in a way.
We just didn't see any way that that was what happened. You know, she was murdered.
I think Danan was such an innocent soul. I don't know how she could have handled the last few minutes of her life, and with whomever might have been there taking her life from her.
This is Catalyst, an investigative podcast from KXAN News. I'm your host, Josh Hinkle. This 7th season of Catalyst.
I don't think there's anything that is sadder than a young girl dying.
A case closed for nearly 60 years resurfaces as our team begins investigating a statewide system for certifying deaths.
In counties that do not have medical examiners, when an unattended death happens, a justice of the peace is called to go and perform what's called an inquest.
Elected officials in positions unique to Texas can determine how someone died, with scant training and often no medical expertise.
I think it's a rarity, but all of us at some time probably don't think, well, should I have done this or something to that nature.
Possible change following our questions about this antiquated process and how it's played out over 200 years.
When you see locally your JPs are being overwhelmed because of the workload that they have, well, then it's time to take action.
If you drive Highway 281 through the Texas Hill Country at the right time of year, you'll pass fields of bright bluebonnets, stretching across the horizon for only a few weeks. That sweet spot until the triple-digit temperatures of summer force them into hiding. Just a little farther, before the highway intersects with Farm Road 1431, you'll hit an oasis of a town. A refreshing stop in Burnett County, with a lake bearing the same name. Marble Falls. Early photos show the natural rock formations with water cascading down into the lower Colorado River there. Barely a decade old by 1900, Marble Falls had just under 2,000 residents, a number that wouldn't grow much until the turn of the next century, as Texas' nearby capital city, Austin, began to boom. Paved roads and electric streetlights came in the 1920s, and in the 50s, the dam holding back Lake Marble Falls, which now conceals the town's namesake beneath its surface. All part of history. Some of it documented by a local, Ronnie Lewis.
Hey.
Hey, man.
How you doing, sir? Good to see you.
Hey, I'm Josh.
Josh.
Nice to meet you.
A friend had sent me Ronnie's blog and Facebook page about a year ago, one puzzling post in particular.
All right. Y'all come on in.
Ronnie invited readers to remember with him what life was like growing up here.
I have a Facebook group called the Angora Chronicles, and it's been in existence for 10 years now, and we pretty well try to cover different topics from the Marble Falls, Burnett County area, just historical content. I started writing stories, just something I could leave behind for my kids and my grandkids. And I think that's where the success of the Facebook group came about.
Where'd you come up with that name for the publication and everything?
Oh, just one of my friends suggested it. My brother was 2.5 years older than I am. Back in the 1960s, our first business venture together was Angora Goats. We each bought 20 goats. Just one of my classmates that was on Facebook with me, I started talking about doing a group, and he said, well, why don't you call it the Angora Chronicles, the musings of an old goat.
Those musings now have well over 3,000 followers, a collection of people captivated by not only the charm of the area, but also its secrets, some hidden away for years.
And when I would think back over my life, it was like, That's unbelievable, that the things that happened.
What was it like growing up in Marble Falls in the 1960s?
For me, I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better place to be. It was still rural for the most part. It was so easy to have a large group of friends around you all the time. That's what I remember most, are just the friendships that I made, and so many of those people that are still a part of my life.
How many people were you going to school with?
I graduated in 1970. I think there were around 60 in our class. There was certainly less than 1,000 people in the entire Marble Falls school system at that time.
That's when we turned to the reason for this visit, why I wanted to meet Ronnie. That post.
It was called The Young Girl That Was Murdered Down by Backbone Creek.
Ronnie Lewis. She went by her middle name, Danan.
She was in the same grade as I was. And I had only started the school in Marble Falls that year. For my eighth grade, I had gone to a small.
It was 1965. Ronnie and Danan were both 13 years old.
This incident happened in November, so within 3 months of us starting the school, well, then she was no longer with us, and it just always was a story that haunted all of us. There were several of my classmates that lived within a few blocks of her.
Danan lived in a little house with her parents, 2 brothers and a sister. Their back door was just feet from the banks of Backbone Creek, a smaller stream winding through town and emptying into the lake. Where it ran through Danan's neighborhood near downtown, thick clumps of trees canopied over the water, darkening what churned below.
Back then it was extremely woodsy. Many of the streets that now cross Backbone did not exist back then, so there were trails that you could walk if you chose to go into town on foot. There were little patches, there were little hideaways that we would have back in the brush where you could go and have your little secret fort or whatever you want to call it, things like that. If it had water in it, wonderful, we might catch some crawdads. But in the summertime, depending on how much moisture we had, how much rain, you didn't want to go exploring too much because you would come home covered in chiggers and goat heads.
Summers were when Darlene Ostermeyer would visit Marble Falls.
As I remember that area of town, very few fences separated houses. You could probably walk an entire block and cross 3 or 4 house yards, and nobody would make a peep because there were no sidewalks back then. You either walked in the street or you walked through somebody's yard. So very, very open, and everyone knew everyone. They knew their kids. You played with all the kids. It was just kind of, you want to say one huge family, but that's kind of like what it was, because half of us were related to somebody in the neighborhood anyway.
You were related to Danan, right?
Yes, she was a second cousin, if you want to count it that way. Her grandmother and my grandmother were sisters. She was a couple of years younger than I. I came up only in the summer and got to see her in summers. When school started, I went back home and she was in school here.
Across Backbone Creek, the old schoolhouse still stands, a 2-story granite structure, stately even today as a museum where Darlene now sits on the board.
Can you imagine all of the feet that have walked on these wooden floors? That to me is just telling.
It was the town's first public school, today showcasing the history of Marble Falls, including one of the classrooms with its original lockers and framed photos of past students.
A couple of weeks ago, we had 3 women in their 80s who went to school here. The most fun is to see kids, teenagers come in and look for Granny and Granddad.
On this day, it was just Darlene and us. Ronnie stopped by too.
Ronnie, do you remember these picture days?
Oh yeah. And actually all of these people, I still have a connection to them to today.
After our chat at his house, Ronnie had dug out some old yearbooks and brought them by the next afternoon.
This is a picture of Danan. This is a picture of me. We're both named Lewis, so naturally we would come close together. This would have been in the fall.
September of 65, right.
Yes.
Danan Lewis was standing on the steps where we'd entered earlier, part of a group photo.
And this is just out of the front door of this building.
On the next page, individual pictures. Ronnie with his dark hair slicked down, Danan with hers in a ponytail and a light-colored headband.
And she had beautiful blonde hair.
Blonde hair. Yeah, long blonde hair.
The corners of Danan's mouth turned up slightly in a closed smile. Her eyes focused almost ominously at the camera.
She was just a pretty girl. You wouldn't really notice much about her. She's kind of stayed in the background. She was just maybe on the shy side, if nothing else.
I mean, she bordering on shy, even with those of us who saw her a little bit more than not.
Evidently, the pictures were taken at the very start of the school year.
So she would have gotten this picture and then passed away a few months later.
Yes.
Within weeks, I would imagine.
How did you learn what had happened?
I went home Labor Day of '65, but then we came back for Thanksgiving. And that was when I found out about the mishap, as I'll call it, because I didn't know what else to call it at the time. It kind of shattered our family, finding it out from Granny and Granddad that something went terribly wrong.
Kind of the common knowledge at the time is that she had gone home and she went in and mixed up a cake and put it in the oven for them to have that night for dinner. And then she started mopping the kitchen. And then all of a sudden, then she disappeared.
Newspaper archives say Danan's older brother had seen her around 6 the evening of November 18th, 1965. 2 hours later, he and a few friends found her.
The cake's still in the oven, burned by the time I guess somebody got there. And that's kind of what tipped them off that she was missing.
Danan was dead, hanging by a jump rope wrapped around her neck and tied to a ceiling beam inside a small shed behind their house.
And it was always said that she was hanging like from a rafter or something, but her knees were touching the ground. Well, it didn't take, much imagination to figure out something's wrong.
It just didn't make any sense. Even to my immature mind at the time, did not make sense. It just didn't seem conceivable, not just not in our family, but not even in our community. That was what was so strange.
Marble Falls had no police department back then, though town marshals, the sheriff, and Texas Rangers are listed in the newspapers as being part of the initial investigation. But the final determination of how Danan died came down to a man named Carlisle Wall, known to most as C.B. Wall. He was the Justice of the Peace in Burnett County Precinct 4, an elected position that came with plenty of power and a variety of responsibilities, including death inquests, essentially a review of the cause and manner of death. On Danan's death certificate, Wall listed the cause as an accidental strangulation, suggesting she tied the rope around her own neck too tight. It's a narrative Judge Wall maintained since the beginning, telling the local paper early on he was convinced she died of an accidental hanging.
Could you imagine that something like this was an accident?
No, it just seemed more of a fanciful cover-up, if nothing else.
It's what several of Ronnie's followers felt when he first posted about the case.
There would be more discussion on those threads than just about anything else we did, because there was so much left unsaid that people really wanted to know, and people wanted to talk about it.
It kind of takes on a life of its own.
It does. As soon as you start talking about it, there may be 50 or 100 people will chime in and give different thoughts that they have of what could have happened.
There was an undercurrent somewhere, somehow, that must have caused this to happen, because I don't think she died by her own hand.
There were too many questions left lingering, too many discrepancies people just couldn't let go. Like on the death certificate, Judge Wall wrote Danan was playing in the shed with others. But it took 2 hours for her brother and his friends to find her hanging there.
My family always thought something wasn't quite right, just didn't sit well with us.
Have there been thoughts about what could have happened?
My grandmother had certain theories, and some of them are very unpleasant to think about, one of which might be the truth. other than what was listed on the death certificate.
What are some of the theories that you've heard over the years about what might have happened in this case?
There was some sexual abuse by a family member was one theory. There was somebody that was visiting the neighborhood that had a bad criminal history that could have done it. He had some peeping Tom issues, and he was staying within a few houses of Danan's family. That was one explanation that could have happened.
In the days after Danan's death, Judge Wall lashed out in the paper, as one reporter said, obviously angry regarding rumors about foul play. He even offered a $100 reward, worth about $1,000 today, for information leading to an arrest and conviction in the case. That never happened.
A justice of the peace is an elected position. With any elected position, there's always the question about politics.
You look back on it, politics does play a role in everything.
Judge Wall would face another election for a fourth four-year term, just 6 months after Danan died.
I mean, there's a lot of speculation.
Speculation that almost seemed to flow along Backbone Creek, Danan's neighborhood, the precinct where Wall ruled several deaths, accidents, or suicides that year. Something officials today tell us would be cause for careful consideration and an expert medical opinion, especially those cases involving children.
It wouldn't take very much of an investigator to figure that out, that there's something doesn't smell right about the whole thing.
And while Wall had discretion to err on the side of caution and ask a local doctor to conduct an autopsy, or maybe even send bodies to a bigger county with a medical examiner, he didn't. In all of these cases, including Danan's.
They're all trying to look as good and not have a bunch of unsolved cases laying around. And if they're going to get reelected, it was just going to be too hard to solve. Close the book, we'll move on to the next thing. And I think that did happen. And that just kind of put it all to bed. And I think that's, that's what really rankles so many of us.
Records from any investigation in that area of Marble Falls from the 60s are now missing. Officials found nothing in the archives except Danan Lewis's death certificate. But that single document and the rest of our research was enough to spark a new review of the case by the woman who sits in Wall's seat today, part of a judicial system unique to Texas, dating back 2 centuries. And leaving some skeptics to question whether the state needs more modern methods for investigating death. Coming up.
From 1965 to today is like the Dark Ages to the modern world.
Under current law, in the absence of a medical examiner, the Justice of the Peace is responsible for determining the cause of death.
Very few of us have medical examiner offices, and I consider it a moral imperative.
To learn more about this case, watch our docuseries and explore our digital investigation online now at kxan.com/Backbone Creek. Catalyst is reported and produced by me, Josh Hinkle, along with David Barrere, Arzo Dost, Eric Henriksen, and Dalton Huey. Our editor is Richie Bose. Digital support comes from Robert Sims and Kate Winkle. KXAN's news director is Haley Syhawk, and its general manager is Eric Lasberg.